Hi there. In today's video, I'm going to show you how to set your camera up to photograph fireworks. Fireworks are pretty awesome to do and really simple when you just know a few of the simple settings and some simple gear to have. So tip number one, gear. A camera you've got full manual control over, makes sense. A tripod, preferably a sturdy one, because you're going to be taking exposures of anywhere up to 10 seconds, and a remote shutter release, like this one. So the camera you're going to want to have full manual control over. The priority modes don't really work for photographing fireworks because it's nighttime. The camera gets confused in how to set the exposure. So using shutter priority or aperture priority doesn't really help out here. Having a wide lens, something like a 15 to 30 mil, depending on how far you are away from the action, is pretty good. That's usually wide enough to get everything in the scene, including some foreground landscape to give you a bit of context and size. That said, having a zoom lens sometimes to be able to get right into the depths of the scene can produce some pretty cool shots, but you've got to be aiming in the right area. Not something that I'd recommend for your first time out. The tripod, pretty important. Having a really stable tripod is the way to go. You've got long exposures of up to 10 seconds at a time. If you don't have a tripod, making sure that you can have the camera set on something that's flat and sturdy and pointing at the sky and it's going to be nice and stable will get you by in a pinch. And a remote shutter release. I prefer corded ones like this. It's just a simple generic brand. You can get them for just about any camera. And what they allow you to do is, instead of trying to time exposures in 5 seconds or 10 seconds, you can actually just press and hold and the camera will take the shot and then let it go when you're happy with the grouping that you've gotten in the sky. Now, I prefer simple corded remotes compared to wireless ones or Bluetooth ones, because honestly, I find when they work, they're great, but when they won't connect, they can be frustrating as hell. These remote triggers, you can get them quite cheaply at any camera store and they're a great backup to have in your bag. So I prefer using them over the wireless versions. Tip number two, use bulb mode if you have a remote shutter release. Bulb mode means that for as long as you hold the shutter down, the camera will take an exposure. Once you release the shutter, it'll stop. This gives you more control over the manual exposures because sometimes you can't be sure, is 5 seconds enough, is 10 seconds enough? So having that full control with a shutter release is the way to go. To set your camera to bulb, it should have B on the dial. If it doesn't have B on the dial, then in manual mode, scroll your shutter out to 30 seconds and that will be displayed by the little inches. It'll say 30 inches, which is seconds, and then just scroll it that little bit more and hopefully a little B comes up. Once that B comes up, B is for bulb, that means that when you press and hold the shutter, it'll expose, and once you release, it'll stop. The best thing about the remote trigger is that it means that you don't have to be touching your camera. Stability is everything, and if you've ever seen some fireworks photos where the fireworks are a little bit wavy, it's probably because somebody was holding down the shutter on their camera and there's no way you can be stable with that. So with the shutter release, it just means that you're not touching the camera at all. But what if you don't have one? My recommendation would be in manual mode, set your exposures to about 5 seconds and also set your camera to have a 2-second delay so that you can gently press the shutter. The camera will do a 2 count, then expose for 5 seconds and stop. With a little bit of practice, you'll start hearing the heavy thumps of the bigger mortars shooting huge fireworks into the skies. As soon as you hear that, give your trigger a little press, and hopefully by the end of that 2 count, some awesome sources happening up there, 5-second exposure, and then it'll shut it down. You're ready to go for the next one. Tip number 3. So start out with an aperture around f8 and your ISO, you want to set it to 100. Now don't leave your ISO on auto because it too will just pop and go unnecessarily high and potentially blow out your image. ISO 100 is plenty for fireworks. Fireworks are super bright. With your aperture, you start at f8 and you might close it down to maybe f11, f13. You'll do this after reviewing the image, which I'm going to talk about in a further step. Tip number 4. Be conscious of where you're setting up and where the crowds might be. Last thing you want is to get a really prime position and then have some lumbering 7-foot Goliath stand in front of you for the whole show. Having your camera set up in front of a railing or somewhere where it's basically going to prevent people setting up in front of you is definitely going to help. And when you're setting up, sometimes it might be beneficial to actually get away from the crowds. Go somewhere different. Get a different perspective on the scene. So having some buildings in the foreground or some trees, or get up a hill and shoot down into the fireworks. Anything. Just get creative and find yourself something interesting. Tip number 5. If you can, compose your shot before it gets fully dark. If you've got that wide lens on, try and get some of the foreground landscape and maybe the people where the crowd is going to be to give the image some context and scale. When we see just fireworks in the sky, you can't really appreciate how large they are unless you can see the tiny little people down on the ground below. Once you've composed your shot and make sure you've got it in focus, now set your lens to manual focus. Manual focus means that when you go and press the shutter later, the camera is not going to re-hunt and try and focus onto the sky, which is going to have difficulty doing. Leaving the camera in manual focus means that it won't readjust. Tip number 6, preview your first few shots, and if you've got your histogram, make sure you're not clipping into your white. If your histogram is hard to the right and your previews are showing you that you've got these flashing white areas in there, it means that you're blowing out the scene. So you don't want to change your ISO, you don't want to change your shutter, you change your aperture. If you start at f8, close it down, maybe go to f11 or even f13. Just make sure that everything is controlled with the light and it's not being so bright that you're losing that detail. And tip number 7, and this is probably one of the most important ones, don't forget to enjoy yourself. Fireworks are fantastic to watch and they're a lot of fun to photograph as well, but you don't want to get so caught up in trying to capture the shot that you're actually missing out on the show. Hopefully after the first 5 minutes you're going to get your settings dialed in, and especially if you've got that remote shutter, you can now just sit back and watch the sky and enjoy the show. So I hope you found that useful, and if you did, have a think about hitting that like button for me, or maybe even a subscribe. And the next time you go to a fireworks show, you're going to capture some amazing shots that you're going to be proud with.